Welcome back to the Timeline Astrology podcast. Today my guest is Ronnie Dreyer. Ronnie has been on the show before. We talked all about the eclipses of 2020, and I asked her back on to talk about the eclipses of this year, 2021. Ronnie Dreyer is an internationally known astrological consultant, a lecturer and teacher specializing in both Western and Indian astrology, and she's based in New York City. So I was very pleased to have Ronnie back on the show to talk all about the eclipses that are occurring in Taurus and Scorpio, that is sidereal Taurus and Scorpio. And I hope you enjoy.
Yeah, it's great to talk to you about the eclipse, because when I think about the eclipses, I actually now think of you. I don't know if that's a good or bad thing, but it's like, I'm like, who would I speak to about eclipses? And I'm kind of thinking, yeah, no, Ronnie, of course. So that's why I think it's a great thing that we're connecting again about the eclipses this year, because we've already had one, of course, the full moon total lunar eclipse in Scorpio, quite an intense one, and we're in the middle of these two eclipses now with the upcoming one on June 10th. And the first thing I thought of asking you was, when you're looking at any given year, how do you approach it? Like, you can be as specific or as general as you want, but when you look at a year like 2021, how do you approach the eclipses and what you're going to be looking at?
Right. Okay. So, I mean, there's obviously a lot to say about eclipses. You can say it from an astronomical point of view, and you can also say it, from an astrological point of view. So, so when I look at that, for, let's say, a certain year, one of the first things I actually do look at is just to say, okay, are we having, total eclipses? Are we having partial eclipses? Because especially from an astrological point of view, when you have total eclipses or annular eclipses, like the next solar eclipse is going to be, which I'll explain, then what happens is that the nodes, which I work with a lot, with the eclipse degree and the nodes, the node and the eclipse degree are much closer together when you have a total eclipse or an annular eclipse, as opposed to a partial eclipse. And as we discussed these four eclipses that are occurring this year, and I talk about the nodes, you'll see what I mean. But especially from the fact that, well, we have to bring in the last two of 2020, but okay. So when I look at these eclipses, the first thing that I see, is the fact that, first of all, the one we just had was a total eclipse. And that was a lunar, and it was the first total lunar eclipse since January 2019. Actually, since then, we've only had partial eclipses. So this one, which, is called like the blood moon eclipse, because it's total, you could see that red, that red color, which is what we had in 2019, January, with a few of them back to back in 2018 and 19. So that's the first thing I see. Wow, we have a total eclipse, and it's the first one in a while. And then the one on June 10th, that one is also an annular eclipse, which is very close to the nodes. And then in November 2021, we have another lunar that's partial, and a December 4th solar, which is total. So that's the first thing I look at when I look at okay, we have a couple, total eclipses, or with the annular one, the solar, they're close. And then I look at the lunar and solar, see if there are four, or like last year there were five. So this year we have, and because we have every 6 months, 2 eclipses. Sometimes we have 3, like last summer we had 3, in June and July, but mostly there are 2, and then in 6 months, another 2. The one in May, which just passed, was a lunar. So we have a lunar and a solar. And then we have in November and December, again, a lunar and a solar. Sometimes we have a solar and a lunar. This time it's lunar to solar, which means we're going into a waning cycle with the eclipses. So we have a lunar to to solar, which is full moon to new moon now. Right now we're in the midst of that eclipse period. And then we will have the same in November, December. So that's what I look at first. And then I'm going to look at the signs that they're in. And I'm going to look at the nakshatras, but that comes a little last. But the reason these are, of course, important is that, you know, they follow the nodes, in a sense, because the nodes occur in a sign, you know, every year and a half. Every, you know, 18 months or so, we get the, you know, the nodal cycle. And so the eclipses, you know, are also pretty much in the same signs as that. So when we look this year, you know, for instance, we have all the eclipses in Taurus and Scorpio, which we also had in November 30th and December 14th. So that's what happens. You get eclipses that are going to be in the same sign, you know, for about a year and a half, but sometimes they'll switch back and forth before they go permanently into one sign for about a year and a half. But the Taurus Scorpio ones, the reason these have been interesting is that they really have been only in Taurus and Scorpio. So the lunar eclipse of November 30th, 2020, I have to start with that one because that one is very still connected with all of these eclipses. And that one was at 14 Taurus. The lunar eclipse means that since it was on November 30th, the moon was at 14 Taurus because it's a full moon, it's a lunar. And then December 14th, 2020, the solar eclipse was 29 Scorpio. So that's why these were only in Taurus and Scorpio, because the one on December 14th was on the very last degree. Normally it might go, you know, into the next, it might have stayed in the previous degree. So it might have been in Sagittarius instead of Scorpio, but because it was 29, it was in Scorpio. And then this last eclipse, May 26th, the one we had last week, that was also a full moon, so it was 11 Scorpio. The solar eclipse of June 10th, which is coming up next week, that's going to be at 25 Taurus. The lunar on November 19th is going to be at 3 Taurus. The solar, December 4th, is going to be at 18 Scorpio. So we've actually had 6 eclipses, one after another, in Taurus and Scorpio, and which is a little odd because, like I said, the one on December 14th at 29 Scorpio, normally that might have been at like 1 or 2 degrees of Sag, so it would have slipped into the sign previous. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of an interesting bunch of eclipses, you know, by sign alone. Because then when we go into, you know, April 2022, for those next 4 eclipses of 2022, it's going to be in Aries, but then we're going to have one on May 16th. That's going to slip back into Scorpio, but 1 degrees. You know, like I said, that would have been normally the one in December where it would have gone. So we're going to have one more Taurus and Scorpio after this one next year, but then it's going to be permanently in Aries and Libra. Now that's a lot of Taurus and Scorpio, mm-hmm. you know, with these eclipses. So that's, so you asked me what I look at. That's the first thing.
That's the very first layer of many
that's
layers.
A long story.
But yeah, I'm sure, like, because it's like, it is a long story. It is like when we think about the nodes, I guess, and the arc that they draw, and you think about the sun, moon, earth relationship, it's like the whole arc of our experience, you know, the cosmic arc, you know, it's like, that's why it's such a long and evolving story. And that's what they represent, our evolution, really, where we're coming from, where we're going to, what we're developing.
Right.
But we could talk more about the Taurus Scorpio. I really want to talk more about that. But I want to just go back to what you said there about the fact that this year's eclipses are lunar, then solar. So it's the waning cycle on both occasions. Can you say a little bit more about that and what that might suggest?
Well, you know, one of the best books to look at really for a whole chapter on eclipses is Brihat Samhita, which is Varahamihira, and that is from the 6th century. And that book is a, kind of an amalgamation of a lot of different things. And it's not him writing originally only. A lot of the things in his texts come from previous centuries, and they're all kind of put in together. And some things are his original, of course. But he does have one chapter, on like the transits of each of the planets of the grahas, and the chapter on Rahu is about mostly about eclipses. And so a lot of the information you'll get, now some of it, of course, is hard to apply, but it's chapter 5. And the thing is that even in this particular text, he does say that should a solar eclipse occur at the end of the fortnight, again, I'm reading the translation book I have, it's not my own translation. Should a solar eclipse occur at the end of the fortnight after a lunar, people would become unruly and unjust in their behavior. And couples, would have problems. And then should a lunar take place at the end of the next fortnight after a solar, it says the Brahmins would perform many sacrifices and be blessed with the fruit thereof, and all the subjects would be happy and contented. So really what he's saying is that if you have an eclipse and, it starts with the solar and goes to the lunar, it, kind of acts like you would normally expect a waxing cycle to be, that it would be fruitful, and the waxing cycle would then be, very productive. Whereas if you go from a full moon to a new moon, because, the new moon is dark. So if you go from the full moon to the new moon, or the lunar to the solar, it's not going to be, as fruitful. Now, I have to say that in all honesty, that it sounds really great in theory, but it doesn't always, I don't know, it doesn't seem to always, work out that way. And, that's, just, what I'll say. I mean, it doesn't mean to say that just because something is in a text, that, we think that it has to always, follow and be perfect that way. But I do find that, as a general rule, if you want to talk about that, the only reason, one of the reasons I say that is also because if you go back to the December 2019, there was an eclipse, December 26, 2019. That was a solar. And that was one of the ones that I did think that it really kind of portended for not such nice things in 2020. I think we talked about this last year. And then the January 10th eclipse, 2020, was a lunar. So that did go in a waxing cycle, but that was really when, it started to become known that there was this virus, So I don't know in that case.
Right. It's interesting when you think about the increase and decrease, the waxing and waning, and even in that sense, and where you were looking at that eclipse in December 2019, and that then led to a full moon lunar eclipse, that kind of increase of that. What I found really interesting as well is just looking at, even though it's not an eclipse, but the next full moon, we've just had a total lunar eclipse. The next full moon on the 24th of June is at the same degree as that eclipse, at 9 degrees of Sagittarius. So I kind of thought, okay, it's not an eclipse, but at the same time, are we at some sort of culmination point, or are we at some turning point in this pandemic, perhaps, in June? It's interesting when you look at, because when you look at the eclipses, obviously, and I'm sure you are always considering the eclipses, but every lunar phase, every full moon and new moon each month. So that was something I thought was interesting. But one other thing I remember Camilla Sutton mentioned about, this, I don't know if you found this to be true yourself, is that when there's a lunar followed by a solar, she says something like that it's more worldly concerns, as opposed to the solar, then the lunar, more like spiritual issues. I don't know, maybe it's just like you just said, it's like the waning, right? It's the waning of the moon. And so there's maybe more what she would say worldly concerns, maybe issues on the planet.
Yeah, I mean, my biggest problem with some of that is that it sounds really great in theory, but I just don't find it always works out that way. But I do find that it is interesting that the last bunch of eclipses, are from lunar to solar. So we are dealing with that, that tendency right now. And the thing is that when you look at the eclipses from last year, because as I said, there were, 3 eclipses, last year in the summer. So we had, the first one after the December and January one, we had one at June 5th, and that was a lunar. So it went from lunar to solar on June 21st, and then it went from solar to lunar on July 5th. So we had a whole month of, we had the eclipses run the gamut of a lunar month. So that's always kind of an interesting one, because when you have 3 eclipses, obviously one of them is going to be lunar to solar and the other is going to be solar to lunar, unless it starts with a solar, then it goes from solar to lunar and then lunar to solar. But, it kind of runs that, runs that gamut. But these coming up, the one from last November, the one from last week, May, the one on November 19th, they are all lunar to solar. And then next year, of course, we're not really going to go into 2022, but 2022 does start a solar to lunar. So that's why I do think that's part of the reason I do think 2022 we're going to have recovery. This year it's kind of going teeter, it goes back and forth. Because, in America, we've been doing really well. And then you look at India and they kind of went completely downhill. You know what I mean? So it's not consistent, throughout the world. Of course, each eclipse, if you did each eclipse for every country, it's going to be different as well. If you have the time to sit and do that. But the point is that, also you have to look at the leader of the country, which I do, all the time, which is what's, especially in America, it's been fascinating with Trump and then Biden. But, I think that the thing is that it is kind of fascinating that from last year, last November through the end of this year, they're all from lunar to solar. And then you get next year, as I said, you get the ones in April and May, solar to lunar. And then you get October, November 2022, again, solar to lunar. And then 2023, solar to lunar. And October 2023, solar to lunar. So it's kind of fascinating that the ones in 2022 and 2023 are all solar to lunar, whereas this year and the end of last year, they're all lunar to solar. So it kind of is interesting if you do look at it that way, that because it doesn't always happen that way, that it's consistent, for a few eclipses like it is now, and then next year, sort of that, upward climb. So it's kind of an interesting thing just to ponder, and look at and think about, sort of interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's great for us to be able to watch this now for the next couple of years to see if we can draw conclusions from it as well with what's going on.
Right. And also these that are going from lunar to solar are all in Taurus and Scorpio, as I said. So that's the other interesting thing, that all of these Taurus Scorpio eclipses, except the one next year that kind of slips back into Taurus Scorpio before it stays in Aries Libra, are all the lunar to solar ones. So it's kind of interesting.
Yeah. What I flagged about because I'd love to talk about now Taurus and Scorpio, more so the dynamics involved there. What I flagged about that, like if you just look back at the last 2 cycles of the nodes there, like the Iraq war last time before that, it was, Band-Aid, Ethiopia, the famine. It's always about resources, it seems, obviously the main theme of Taurus Scorpio. Had you looked at any of those major themes when you were looking at this set of eclipses this year?
Well, I look at the Saros cycle, but I look a lot at that, what we call the Metonic cycle. The Metonic cycle are eclipses that repeat every 19 years. So, when they repeat, that means that, and sometimes in between, you also will get that same degree, but the opposite kind of eclipse. So, so of course, when you're looking at eclipses, when you're starting to really look at the history, of them. One of the things that you're going to look at, of course, are the cycles of the signs. And that's, but the 18 Saros cycle, the 19-year Metonic cycle, the nodal cycle is 18.6 years. So it definitely goes, hand in hand with, that kind of, cycle. So when you look at these particular eclipses, what you get over here is, that Metonic, number one, the Metonic cycle of eclipses means that the one May 26th that we just had last week, that was at 11 degrees of Scorpio. And then you get the one 19 years prior, May 2002, May 26, 2002. It's the exact day. And that one was also at 11 degrees of Scorpio. And then in between, you get a couple too, because the nodes switch, you know what I mean? So, you might get, you might get the nodes where you have the north node in Taurus and south node in Scorpio. And then you're going to get, at some point midway, you're going to get Rahu in Scorpio and Ketu in Taurus. So, it switches. So when I look at that Metonic cycle, it's kind of interesting when you're looking at, those, of course, the nodal cycle. And then you're going to get here November 2011 and May 2013. You're going to have also the eclipses in Scorpio, 8 degrees and 10 degrees of Scorpio. So May 24th, 2013, you get another lunar eclipse also. And that's going to be at 10 degrees of Scorpio. So they kind of like are switching, but then you get the, and then you get the same thing with June 2021, the one next week. The one next week is interesting because the Metonic cycle means every 19 years they repeat on the same day, but usually it happens about 3 times, 3 19-year cycles, then it stops just because of the geometry of the spheres. This one was very much geared towards, this was 4 years, the one on June. The one next week is an interesting annular eclipse. It's that ring of fire eclipse. And that one was June 10th or 11th, 1964. And then it was also 1983. And then it was 2002 and now 2021. So it does go with those, with the nodal cycle, like that. And right. When you are talking, and so when you are talking about events, and you're really looking at these cycles, you were talking about, like, what were you talking about, the famine and things like that, and sustenance and resources. You can really, the thing is with history though, is that you can take any period and really look at like major shifts and major events. Every period sort of has, its, I don't know if you'd call it craziness or it's, really heavy duty, heavy duty events, that take place. So,
but I mean, of course, Scorpio and, Taurus are where, Parashara talks about them being exalted, Rahu in Taurus, Ketu in Scorpio. So would you say that it's the fact that they're so strong that they are more able to be more malevolent in a way?
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing is that you have to look at, everything else that's with it, especially around those eclipses. Like last year we had Mars Ketu. This year, again, we're going to have Mars Ketu near an eclipse in December. But I think the other thing is that, when you're looking at this, you have to, you can say that in terms of the exaltation. Some people, some astrologers also say that they are exalted in Gemini and Sagittarius.
Right.
But I always look at it as the fact that Rahu acts like Saturn. So if you're talking about Saturn, it's always going to work better in a Venus ruled sign or a Mercury ruled sign. So, the fact that, they are in Taurus and Scorpio, Gemini and Taurus. I don't know. I mean, you could say that an exalted planet, especially an exalted node, because it is so malefic, that the maleficence, is that how I say, the maleficence of it, can be, really, really intense. But, the other thing really is also that if you really kind of look at where the planets, are, and where they've been, in terms of the, I think in terms of the aspects to them, and in terms of the, planets that are going to be in the same, area of the zodiac and the same signs. I think it should probably go beyond that, and go a little bit beyond just the fact that they're in Taurus and Scorpio, because that's where they are now. I mean, now they are in Taurus and Scorpio. They started in September last year to move into Taurus and Scorpio, and then next March they'll move into Aries Libra. If you're looking at pandemic and things like that, the pandemic really started when they were in Gemini and Sagittarius, not in Taurus and Scorpio. But then you would get that if you're going by other astrologers who say Gemini, Sag, yes, you're getting like a year and a half, you're getting a 3-year period really, where the nodes are in the two signs that people attribute to their exaltation. So that is interesting.
It's interesting because that's true. And also, I've heard other astrologers say how, well, actually, when they're debilitated, if they're the other way around, Ketu in Taurus and Rahu in Scorpio, they're even more malefic, because if you feel hard done by, you're going to lash out even more in a way. If you feel very strong, you're less likely to. So you can see the good and the bad sides of each, I guess.
Yeah.
But in terms of Gemini and Sagittarius, it's interesting because of the lunar signs involved as well, of course, in terms of Ardra and Mula and all of that. But I would love to talk as well about the lunar signs that are involved this year, 2021. So, of course, we have just had one in Anuradha. That's the total lunar. We're about to have one in Mrigashirsha, and then we're going to have another set, one in Kritika, and then the last one finishing the year as we had last year in Jeshta. So shall we talk about maybe we just stick to the solar? I mean, we can talk about the lunar as well, but the significance of having a solar eclipse in Mrigashirsha coming up on the 10th of June, and then finishing the year in December in Jeshta. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, well, I mean, these are all, you can take any of these and just look at them and think, what are the symbolism, anyway, with Mrigashira and with, with Jeshta. And the thing is that when you're looking at that, especially the one coming up, the one coming up in June is interesting because of the fact that when you're, obviously when you're looking at different countries, when I have it in front of me, I just do it for Washington, but that's a whole other story. But these eclipses, especially because of, where the nodes are and in relation, to those eclipses, because the node for the June ones coming up has already hit it. So the node of the moon, especially if you're looking as I do with the true node, the true node was very, very heavy around that degree. Obviously I'm going to be a little bit America-centric here because of the fact that I live here. So it doesn't mean that I don't take the world into account. I obviously do. But the whole idea of the fact that these nodes, because these eclipses are all in Taurus and Scorpio, the nodes, when they hit these eclipses, are kind of overlapping. So sometimes what you're getting is the node hitting the eclipse, and then the next eclipse, the node hits it at another date. But these eclipses are all kind of drawn together because they are all, on very, very similar degrees as well. They're maybe 4 degrees apart. So when you look at that and you're looking, and I'm not I'm not diverting from your question. It's just, to me, it's kind of related, you know. So the thing is that, you know, because I do look at these I mean, I look kind of at these nodal things, and then the nakshatras are important as well. But when I look at this, you know, eclipse, let's say coming up, the solar, on June 10th, you know, the degree of that eclipse, you know, which, you know, is 25 degrees of Taurus, between 25 and 26, you know, we had the node, you know, especially the true node kind of stays very, very slow around 1 degree, around a certain degree, you know, when it's near an eclipse. So right after that December eclipse last year, the December 14th eclipse, you know, the node was already at 25 degrees. So that node was kind of like at the same degree as this June one coming up. So it sat around that degree in November, December, January. You know, I do this year ahead thing. I thought there would be, you know, I always note when the node is going to be exactly on the eclipse degree, even though it hovers there for a little bit. So like was exactly there on January 2nd. So then January 6th, at least in America, we had that insurrection. But the reason I bring it up is not because I'm so America-centric, but because of social media. That was an event that was broadcast to the whole world. You know, I mean, I got letters, you know, emails and phone calls from people, my friends and from all over the world, like what's going on in your country, you know? So it wasn't just a nasty event that happened in America. It was something that affected the world, because now some of those beliefs, you know, of things like QAnon, I mean, people are talking about this in all areas of the world, in all societies, and I'm sure in Ireland, in the UK, in Europe, everywhere, those, you know, diverse political beliefs are, you know, kind of separating everybody in the world. It's not just in America. You know what I'm saying? They've become so polarized, you know, because social media just makes everything more intense. So my point is that the nodal degree at 25 degrees was really there in November 20th, in November 2020, December, January. Now it's coming there again. Mars hit that degree in April. And, you know, in April, you know, like there's so many events, you know, you can't like really keep track of every single event that happens, but Mars hit the 25 degrees of Taurus in April. And the thing is that what happens also is that April time was when India's pandemic just exploded. Also, we had the, you know, I think the beginnings of the Israeli conflict. So the Mars, that's what Mars does when it hits an eclipse degree. So we have been, and so Mars, of course, is in Mrigashira. So Mrigashira is a nakshatra ruled by Mars. So the point is that, going back to your question, we have malefics in malefic nakshatras. And that doesn't mean Mrigashira is a malefic nakshatra, because it's not really. It's got a lot of beautiful aspects and, you know, electional, you know, astrology things that, you know, people do under Mrigashira. But it does mean that I take the sign ruler. Okay, it's in Taurus, it's Venus, but I also take the nakshatra lord, which is Mars, you know. So we're having eclipses in a Mars-ruled nakshatra. And then we had the planet Mars going through that nakshatra, not for the whole year, of course, but, you know, we had it from the middle of March this year through April 24th. And so that became a Mars-related timing, you know what I mean? And that really was, you know, to me, that was when India had the pandemic. I'm sure there's a zillion other things in the world, and Israel. Those are and Israel and the Gaza and the missiles. That's kind of the two events in the last couple months that resonate with me. I mean,
absolutely, yeah. And
maybe you have other events you have in your head are also.
Well, I don't think you can pick out much bigger events than those two, really, because it's like India really, that was really grabbing the world's attention. Still is. I mean, they're still in the midst of it, right? And then, you know, what's happening in Gaza. And it's just fascinating to see how these are getting triggered over and over again. And of course, we can see the Indian chart, the independence chart with Taurus rising and the nodes in that axis, Rahu in, you know, Taurus, Ketu in Scorpio, as that may be being another trigger. And it was interesting to see how the Israeli chart, which we have a date for, of course,
Same
which
year,
again,
exactly.
yeah, it's the same kind of theme over and over again. And it's getting triggered. And interestingly enough, in the Israeli chart, the dasha is Rahu Mars, the very tail end of the Rahu dasha, right? So they're really been squeezed right now. But what I also found really interesting, I don't know, like, this is what I guess it's not something I normally would do, is like, you know, when you have an eclipse, you're going to have one like a solar eclipse, you'll have one 6 months later. And you're looking at, you know, because that's why I like the way you approach eclipses. You look at the cycles and you look at them overall. Whereas it's so easy to look at one and then wait for that one to finish, and then you're looking at the next one. But the truth is, like you say, they're all interlaced. And like K2 right now is transiting the December eclipse that we haven't even had yet, right? And we haven't even had the June one yet, right?
That's right. Yeah, these are all very interestingly interconnected. And I think that does indicate we have a worldwide event that's affecting, you know what I mean? It's not like we have one country that's having its problems and this and that. And that's why I say, when I go back to that insurrection in January, that was not just an American event, even though one might think so. It really affected, you know, because I just heard from a client who was just, you know, for an update. I just made an appointment with her, and her mother lives in Serbia. She's from Serbia, though she's lived in America for years. And she said her mother is, you know, just kind of being filled with, you know, is becoming like like following QAnon on some level. And I said, really, in Serbia? You know, I was like really kind of surprised. Oh, she said, no, it's all over the place. You know, so we live in a world now, because of social media and because of just technology, that we are so interconnected. You know, so anything that happens in one country is really affecting the world in a lot of ways. But the pandemic has really shown that. Now, the interesting thing, of course, with India and Israel, it's always been interesting because they both had independent, Pakistan, because when India got their independence, and then Pakistan was created also with the, you know, the two countries. But the thing is that those two countries got independence around the same time. So that was also kind of really interesting thing. So they do get hit, as you say, you know, because of the nodal axis from that year, you know. So it's a very kind of, yeah.
What struck me about as well, the K2 in Scorpio, if we just look at that just generally as well, K2 in Scorpio, is that, you know, this theme keeps coming up, it seems, and obviously therefore then Rahu and Taurus, this theme of not just resources, but K2 being, I guess, the side of us maybe that we may neglect or reject or not want to look at. And Scorpio is already a sign of things we won't want to look at, like death and disease, for example, right? So when you have K2 and Scorpio, it can, because you are seeing a lot of this worldwide now, this kind of pandemic denial. You know what I mean? That's the most extreme expression of it, of course. But then it's just, sometimes we just need to tune out. Like we need the nice things in life, the Taurus things in life, to be able to deal with all the trauma. It seems to be there's so much trauma, because actually there's interesting. There's a movie coming out next month, Gabor Mate. I don't know if you're familiar with his work, but it's a movie all about trauma and how we're dealing with trauma, or how we don't deal with trauma, and how that creates this residual effect and collective trauma and all of this. So it's like, for me, I think that's what Taurus and Scorpio represent more than anything when the nodes activate them in any way, is that it's basic resources and safety issues and trauma we're dealing with all the time.
Well, they're also fixed signs. So when you're dealing with fixed signs, it also takes longer, you know, for things to change, you know what I mean? Because you're stuck, you know, so you're in Stira signs, you know, and so those are going to be, you know, they are what they are, you know, in terms of the idea of fixity, you know, or in terms of, I mean, positively, you can always say Stira signs are stable, you know, that's the sort of positive end of it. But, you know, the negative end of it is also to say that they're stuck, you know, and
they
it really
don't change too easily.
Right. And so it takes them longer. And like I said, the fact that we have 6 of these eclipses in these signs, are, to me, it's quite remarkable because, I do look at these eclipses, but, you're also, when you're talking about also Jeshta, and of course the solar eclipses in Mrigshira, so you always then are always going to look in the chart where Mars is located, as well. And that's kind of very important. And right now with the June 10th eclipse, Mars is debilitated. It's in Cancer. So, we don't know if something there is going to also, take place. But, it seems that if the, we'll have to see, really. I hate making like definite predictions about, we have to see if this, ceasefire holds. That number one in the Middle East. Because,
or in the Middle East, right.
Yeah, because we do have now Mars in its debilitation. That is on June 3rd, which is in 2 days, Mars goes into Cancer. So, we have to also, look at that. And then it will be in Cancer until mid-July, really, until July 21st. So that's one way, to look at it when you're looking at the nakshatras, look at where the, where that happens, where the Lord of the nakshatra is placed, and also the sign Lord. So you get Venus is in June 10th, Taurus is in Gemini, and then you get Mars in Cancer. And the other thing with this eclipse, of course, is that I always look at the planets close to it, and Mercury is not just retrograde, but Mercury is combust, because it's so close to the solar eclipse, this next one, the one next week. And, when you also have a combustion like that, which is June 10th and December 4th, we're both going to have, again, the Mercury combust. There could be, that could also indicate some downturns with the economy, because Mercury is business, it's also communication and things like that. So those are the ones that, I will, sort of take a little bit of an interest in when you look at the combustion and the retrograde. Well, a lot of times when Mercury's retrograde, you have the combustion. And then Mercury will go direct, third week in June. So I think that this eclipse is interesting. The other reason that this eclipse is interesting, the June 10th one, is that it's an annular eclipse, and that, as I said, it's like this ring of fire that they call it, that you can see, and it is going to be visible. It's gonna, when you look at these eclipses and you look sometimes, where they're visible, I think for me, that's also interesting, because I found that in the past, a lot of times these eclipses will show you different parts of the world that are going to be affected. And this eclipse is, sometimes you can see an eclipse, like 100%, very clearly. You can't see every eclipse in every part of the country, obviously. And this eclipse is going to be visible, according to, you can go on space.com or Wikipedia or nasa.gov. It'll tell you all this information. But I'm just reading this, and it's like it'll be visible from parts of Northeast Canada, Greenland, the Russia Far East, but it is going to appear partial. This is the one that I'm interested in that when you're looking at these eclipses and you can see, let's say it is 75% eclipsed, from 75% eclipsed in America, and I believe in parts of Europe as well. I'll tell you in a minute, because I had it on the screen and it actually just disappeared from my screen. So, when you have certain astrological programs, they're like mapping programs, you could see it, but they can tell you anyway, in these, these websites,
Asked you something while you were looking up that, actually, and maybe just to tie it in with that in terms of how long they have an impact, because you're looking at where it is on the planet, but also what about how long the eclipse occurs for
I
and how
know.
it may have an impact.
Yeah, I know. And everybody talks about the fact that you have to see how many like minutes the eclipse
Right.
lasts, and that will compute. Some people say the lunar computes into months, and the solar computes into years. I'm not necessarily sure about that. I mean, that's another thing. I mean, it's not like I have these 100% theories all the time. But what I do know is that when you do hit that eclipse degree, and the interesting thing, as I said, with this June 10th eclipse, is that the node hit that eclipse in January, November, December, January. Mars hit that eclipse in April. That eclipse is going to be 75% visible in Washington. It's really going to be kind of visible in Washington. And then it's going to kind of swerves. It's like 75% visible in Washington. And then it kind of goes up through, way kind of north, probably like around Iceland or something like that. And then it kind of swerves back, again, when it comes to like Russia and parts of Asia, but north of China, let's say. But the whole idea of, these eclipses and when they are going to be, visible, that's the thing that's kind of interesting, because you do find, as I said, that things will, kind of work themselves out, in that way. So it becomes, North America, East and North, so especially on the East Coast here, a lot of Europe will also be able to see it, Northern Europe and Northern Asia. So these are kind of things to look at. When that becomes active, I think that eclipse already became active because of the fact that the node and Mars were prior to that eclipse. But the other thing is that because that eclipse is, 25 degrees of, 25 degrees of Taurus, what is going to happen is that things are going to, every month, you're anyway going to get a moon where that's going to be at 25 degrees, of Taurus. And then you're going to have at some point, I mean, Mars has already crossed it, but you're still going to have the, Mars aspect it, at different times. So you are going to have, Mars, kind of hitting opposite that degree, when it goes to like 25, 25 Scorpio. And that does take place at the end of the year. Maybe January 2022. But the thing is that does become a hot place when that eclipse hits, which is June 10th. So I do think actually, especially when you're looking at the fact that Mercury is retrograde and Mercury is combust. So that means that Mercury is exactly around that degree, June 12th and 13th, and then Mercury is going to go direct, and that Mercury is going to cross that degree around 4th of July, and things like that. So I think that degree does stay hot, and I think it stays hot because it's a visible eclipse in parts of the country, in parts of the world that are populated. I mean, you get certain eclipses like the one in December, that annular, this pathway, that I'm talking about, where the eclipse starts and then finishes. The one in December, for instance, is like not really visible in places in the world that are populated.
That's one thing I want to ask you, Ronnie, because it's something that I haven't really seen very much, but maybe you have because you follow them so much more closely. When you see an eclipse in a certain area and you say, okay, it's going to impact that area, but it doesn't always seem to play out that way. But then it may be the case that other planets are triggering other eclipses that you're not looking at that time, possibly. I don't know. So it's like, oh, you just forgot about the eclipse that happened there 2 years ago, but now Mars is transiting over here, right? And so you're going to have this like volcano in this place or whatever it might be. Do you notice something like that?
I do. There are, I mean, it's like anything else. I mean, sometimes things really happen, you know, with an amazing, you know, like this amazing sense of, you know, exactitude or something like that, I guess you can say. And then other times it sort of like passes you by and, you know, isn't really doing much. But I have found certain instances that, you know, I've kind of put in my lectures or workshops that are, to me, amazing in a lot of ways in terms of, you know, where these eclipses go. And I do find that even if there are things that happen, you know, that don't necessarily seem to, you know, to us, you know, that are, you know, oh wow, this is so important, it doesn't mean that something hasn't happened in the country, you know, that has been very important, the
Right,
country itself, you know, and things like that.
I'm sure
So
you're also thinking about the Great American Eclipse, because if you look at the American eclipse, it's like literally dividing the country in half. And then whether you want to say that or not, it's literally symbolically divided in half, you know?
it did, and that eclipse was powerful because of the fact, I mean, that's where I really started realizing, I mean, I started looking at this a long time ago, but, you know, I really started looking at this in, you know, when I saw that eclipse, you know, because that eclipse was absolutely visible throughout, you know, from like Oregon down through the Carolinas. But there was an area of that eclipse that was like 75% visible, as this one is, the June 10th one in Washington and the Northeast here. That one was about 75% visible, you know, a few, you know, like miles south and north of that line. I mean, it's hard to explain on a podcast, but, you know, certain, if you have like certain astrology programs, or even I guess on some of the websites, it'll show you the path of the eclipse. And that path in America, of course, we looked at because it was total and people were flocking to see it. But there was below it, it was 75% visible. I mean, it was visible in a lot of places, even though it wasn't 100%. It was 75% visible as it went through the southwest of America. It went right through, for instance, Texas. And if you remember, there were those humongous floods in Houston, Texas. And that area of the country really got hit hard. And then we had these hurricanes in Florida and Puerto Rico and that area. And so what happened actually is that that line where it was 75% visible got hit very hard. And that happened a few weeks after that eclipse, on August 17th, because of the fact that Mars, I think, had hit that degree also. And that was the other thing, is that everybody was talking about Donald Trump because it was on his rising sign, you know, but the fact is that, you know, the way I look at countries, you know, you can look at India and Israel because you know pretty much, but I like to look at the leader of a country and look at that leader as representing the country. So for me, Donald Trump's chart really reflected the fact that the country, you know, got hit really, really, really hard, you know, in that particular area. I mean, there were other eclipses, you know, there was one in December 2020 last year, you know, and that one was very, very, it was a totally, because December 14th, that was when, for instance, in America, they counted the votes and certified, they certified him in the Electoral College. Biden, sorry. And then it also meant that it was in those months, November, December last year, that Brexit was finally accepted, you know. So there were, you know, certain things, but that eclipse of December 14th was 100% visible in South America. It was visible around around Chile, and I believe there was an earthquake or something that happened in that part of the world that didn't get the kind of press, you know what I mean, that Brexit or the American election was getting. But in fact, it was very important, you know, for that particular country.
And of course, we're seeing a lot of like seismic activity again now. as we do all the time with eclipses. I'm just wondering what you think of, you mentioned it already, but what you think about the Mars transit to the eclipse degree. It'll actually happen December 31st. So the very last day of the year, we're having Mars hit off that eclipse in Scorpio, like the 18-degree mark.
Yeah.
What would you say when you look at that? I mean, obviously we don't want to be doomsayers here. There's enough of that going on. But like, what would you say about Mars transiting that eclipse degree in Scorpio?
Yeah. The
I know you don't want to be drawn on making predictions, especially in relation to COVID. But I mean, let's face it, we're not going to be able to go there, or not going to be able to do a podcast without going there somewhat. And that everyone wants to hear, especially when they're listening to a podcast about the eclipses. Well, when might this likely be over, or when are we going to see an easing up or something like that? So what are your thoughts about Mars's transit to that degree at the end of the year and into January?
Okay, so as I said, Mars is going to oppose this solar eclipse degree, and that is 25 degrees of Taurus. That's why the signs are also important, because it does mean that the nodes as well are going to be in those signs in your chart. They're going to transit those signs for a year and a half. And so you have to pay attention to whatever area in your chart it's affecting. And I think that when Mars is going to hit that degree, that means that it's also hitting the degree of this eclipse now. You know what I mean? This June one. So it is going to be very, very, very powerful, because it's hitting the degree of 2 eclipses. Now, the one on June 10th is an annular eclipse, means it's fairly tight because, well, the node hit it in January, but the one in November is a partial. We also had that eclipse last November 30th, and the node hits that eclipse degree in August. So I'm just saying that hasn't even finished yet. And that is the eclipse last November 30th that corresponded with the rollout of the vaccine here in America. It was accepted by the Food and Drug Administration. It was also around the same time as the guy in Iran, who was the head of their nuclear facilities, was assassinated. That hasn't been resolved yet either. So I keep thinking that's going to have some kind of I don't know, resolution is the right word, but we might find more about that. That was last November, around the same time as the November 30th eclipse. That event happens. Always look at events around eclipses. It's just important to look, because that gives you an idea of things that could happen. You know, around this last eclipse, we had a couple things also happen. We had, like I said, there was, the Gaza missiles were really starting to wind down. They also had already agreed to a ceasefire, but also there were a couple of weird accidents. There were some shootings, as always. And that happened around this last eclipse. But this one in June is the same degree, similar as the one in November. So I think what happens is when Mars crosses it, it's also going to be a similar time to when Ketu crosses it. So that's why that eclipse, is also going to be important, because we're going to get the Mars hitting that, lunar eclipse degree of Taurus. It's going to be opposite it. Mars is going to be opposite that degree. And then we're also going to have Rahu conjoining that degree. And so we are going to have, and then we have the solar total in December 4th. That's at 18 Scorpio. And Mars is going to form a conjunction with Ketu December 15th. And then Mars is going to conjunct that degree on December 30th. So yeah, December, January are going to be months where we're going to have something happen that's big. I don't think it's going to be pretty. I think there's going to be Martian stuff going on, actually, because when we had the pandemic last time, we had Mars and K2 also hitting those degrees. So there might be some financial stuff as well. But the thing is that I think that what happens with these planets and these degrees. And again, this April date, the South Node, is also kind of hitting the degree of the eclipse next December 4th. So this is all connected. I guess that's my big thing, is that they are all really connected. In terms of the pandemic, I think it goes, like I said, we start recovering here in America. I believe in the UK, I believe in Ireland, you're also recovering. And in India, it went downhill. So it's kind of weird. As parts of the world recover, other parts of the world are going downhill. I do think there's going to be some revelation as far as China goes, what this virus really, how did it really originate? I think also, if you look at events from, interestingly enough, again, 2002, and you go back to 2002, November 2002, I was looking this up, the SARS epidemic began. So again, that eclipse of 19 years, again, these eclipses that happened 19 years ago, it's interesting because in 2002 in November, we had SARS, and now in November 2021, we seem to be winding down from the virus. But to me, it's sort of like in fits and starts,
Right.
I don't know that it's going to, I think something else is going to happen. But I do think the interesting thing is that if you do the outer planets, I mean, listen, my early training was Western, so I still look at those outer planets. And I look at eclipses, when you have retrogrades and direct stations around those eclipses, it's very strong. So we had Neptune going direct also last year, November 29th, and that was the unveiling of the vaccine and also this assassination. It's interesting, they happen at the same time. And what we're going to have now, actually this summer, we also will have Neptune going retrograde June 26th. Okay, that's going to happen pretty soon after that. We have a Saturn-Uranus square. For those of your listeners that do pay attention to the outer planets, that's going to be the second hit of the Saturn-Uranus square right after this eclipse, June 14th. And then in December, it's going to kind of be the final time. So December is going to be a very heavy month. And the thing is that when you look at all of this, Neptune will also go direct. It's kind of like the same cycle, but Neptune will also go direct November 30th in 2021. So it's also going to go direct in between the next two eclipses. So it's kind of interesting. But I do believe that because in August, the node is going to hit the degree of last November's eclipse. I think that we're going to have something going on with this assassination in Iran, and I think something with the vaccine. I think that the vaccine is going to, like, we've had some fits and starts, meaning that there have been some problems with the vaccine, some of the vaccines. I think that there will be another, either more vaccines available in August or more strains of the virus that they have to develop boosters for. So I don't think this is over, I don't think it's over quite yet. I think 2022 is more of a recovery, not just because of the eclipses. I mean, I look at other things as well, but also because the nodes are changing signs, but also Jupiter is going to be in the same position that it was 12 years ago. We have 12, 13-year cycles for Jupiter, and we go back to 2010, and 2008, 2009, Jupiter, also was, I think that we had that recession, and then Jupiter was in the same area of the chart last year. Again, it was, in its debilitation, but it was a similar cycle. So to answer your question, I think the pandemic is going to have fits and starts. I think we're going to see it going better. Now things are opening. I think we're going to have a little bit of backtracking. I do in August and August, because that's kind of like where the nodal point is, from last November's eclipse, because that was a very partial, lunar. And I think that this eclipse from May 26th the South Node is actually going to hit that degree in September. And Mars is going to hit that degree in December. So, I mean, Mars hits that degree in, December 20th. So what I'm saying is that August and September, watch for something also to happen. Now, that could be something, nothing to do with the pandemic, could be something completely different. Could be another, it could be something with Israel. It could be something with, China, because again, this 75% eclipse is going to be visible right now. So I think that to answer your question, I don't think it's a simple question. I think it's fits and starts. I don't think it's going to end the pandemic anytime soon, but I think that we will have tools to deal with it, I mean, here in America, everybody is kind of getting back to normal because there's a lot of vaccinations. Not everybody's vaccinated, of course, but I think December is going to be a bit of a heavy month with that Mars. Mars can be, it can be deaths of rulers. It's interesting also, well, Prince Philip, I mean, listen, he's in his 90s, he passed away when I think the node was also hit in April. And also, I think there could be something like that cataclysmic event in December, January, when the Mars hits it. Could be an earthquake, it could be terrorism, could be any of those Mars things, it could be you're talking about sustenance, it could be the food supply, things like that, floods, fires. Fires are possible again in November, December. We had a wildfire season last year in America that was a little crazy.
Right. Any and all of the above.
Yeah, any and all of the above. And it's kind of interesting. Like I said, I mean, I know people are concerned about Biden. I know you don't want to leave without that. And people,
yeah, I mean, we could really talk about him a lot because, he has a really interesting chart in terms of these eclipses with all of his, his rising sign, Scorpio, his sun, his Venus. But then as the nodes progress, as Ketu moves into Libra, he's got his Mars there, his ruler there, and his Mercury there, his eighth lord. I mean, one of the things I thought that might be is that maybe, as Ketu is prone to do, it might reveal something about his health. We might find out something about his health. That's the first thing I thought.
Well, the other thing is that, I mean, we can do this again in the fall, the thing is that as I talked to you, as I was talking about Trump, now presidents or leaders of countries have, and again, remember, you also have, you have, let's see, you have Elizabeth is, Queen Elizabeth, let's say, is Aries. Her sun is in Aries. So, I mean, and then we get the nodes next year, Libra, Aries for a year and a half. So that's something to watch for. But I think the other thing is that when you're looking at the leader of a country, is like I was saying, you have to look at the leader of a country in two ways. So you look at the leader as somebody who represents himself. He has a private life, or she has a private life, which you don't always know what's going on. Last December, for instance, when Trump's eclipse was getting hit, it had to do with something in America. We had Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away, and then we had, a new, Supreme Court justice, and that was a big thing. And Trump was already saying the election was going to be, bogus. But he also had a health scare, So that was something that happened. You don't always know what's happening to these people. So I think that we have to look at always the leader of a country both ways. Now, what I was just saying about the aspects of the eclipse, things that are happening in Biden's chart can simply represent the country. It can just represent what's going on in America because he is the leader. And, the same thing, let's say, if you looked at, Boris Johnson's chart, I believe his Mercury was getting, afflicted.
His Mercury is actually at 25 degrees of Taurus.
Right. So he was the node was hitting his Mercury November, December, January. And that's when Brexit finally, happened, got signed. So he had that degree, going on, and he's had a lot of stuff in his personal life.
By the way, he just got married a few days ago.
Right. I was just going to say, he had a lot of things in his personal life. Last year, he had COVID. He had it way more serious, I believe, than Trump. He had a baby. His now wife had a baby. Well, he had a baby too. And Brexit, the country. And now he just got married. And he's getting a lot of flack too. I mean, he's got also that extreme, those extremes. So he's another example, of somebody who is representing the country. When you look at Modi's chart, it's very interesting because Modi has, I've been given 2 signs from Modi. One gives him Libra rising and one gives him Scorpio rising.
Right. Which one do you prefer?
I preferred Libra until this pandemic started now. And now I'm wondering if it's not Scorpio because the Taurus Scorpio axis would be really important. But if you look at the person as representing, the country, again, if you look at, if you look at Modi's chart, the moon is obviously going to be the same pretty much.
And actually that draws me back to what I thought initially about Trump and then started second guessing myself, because oftentimes is the nature of the nodes, you start second guessing yourself. Their nodes, their shadows, they're not very clear. And then you see that Trump had, the December 14th eclipse last year, right on his moon, right? And you think, well, that's obviously a loss, and that's and then you start second guessing. So when you look at Modi now and you see his moon at 8 degrees of Scorpio, you think, well, of course, that must be a loss, and you can see how he is obviously losing popularity in the way he handled the pandemic recently.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, the thing is with Modi is that the moon is, if it's Scorpio rising, it's 9th house Lord, whereas with Trump's chart, it was 12th house Lord. Right. So there's that difference. Again, I mean, I could look at Modi's chart for another time, but I haven't really given it as much. But, he does have those things on eclipse degrees. And I was just looking and thinking with that Taurus Scorpio, like I said, like the eclipses are in Scorpio Taurus from last November through this whole year. So it's kind of interesting if you look at it that way and think, maybe.
It'll be very interesting to see once this all pans out, of course, is that, if it does affect his career and standing, that, do we draw conclusions about then him being Libra rising and the moon ruling the 10th with K2's transit, and we can obviously, this is the great thing about obviously anything happening is that with eclipses, they're so unknowable, really, just like a virus is. And you only get to know about it more the more you test things and test different drugs and things. So it's the same with astrology, I think.
Well, also with eclipses is that, I always look at it as things, things get revealed on eclipses, secrets come out. So, they're shadowy, the nodes, and then you get the eclipses and things sort of get, and that is interesting. That's a nice analogy with the virus. It's true because everything has been hidden. And the other thing that just happened with these eclipses, as I said, is that, nobody has really challenged the Chinese about the lab, although people were saying that in the beginning and last year. I mean, Trump was actually, I must say, very wary of the story of the animals. But now Biden has finally, again, come out with this proclamation around this eclipse season, to say we really have to investigate. We have to investigate to see if it is the lab. But the other thing is that the other thing that I thought was interesting with everybody's charts is when you look at Modi's chart, for instance, the other thing that you get with the Libra rising is you get a lot of planets in the 12th, and I have noticed a lot of politicians have 12th house charts because they have to do that secret thing, and they're not revealing everything, and they're not revealing what their true nature is. I mean, so I have found that a lot, that politicians and leaders tend to have 12th house influences really strong.
Right.
But yeah, I think that but I think with Biden, right now, again, his birth time is one of those birth times, even like Boris Johnson's birth time. It's not a birth certificate time, whereas Trump's was. So I take it a little with a grain of salt. However, there was a newspaper article that he was born in the morning that his parents put in, in those days they announced, their kid's birth. Whether it's 8:30, I don't know. Pretty much he probably does have Scorpio rising, but he might not. But even if he doesn't, he still has the sun there, he has Venus there, and he also, that eclipse, of course, on November 19th is the day before his birthday. So for all intents and purposes, it's in his solar return, and in his Varshapal. And the eclipse is 3 degrees of Taurus. His sun is 4 degrees of Taurus. So he is going to have an eclipse in his solar return for the year. And so, it's definitely a birthday eclipse. It's in Kritika, of course. And with Kritika is ruled by the sun. So again, you have an eclipse and it's fire, it's a burning eclipse. So that's the other thing, what I was saying before with Mars, with fires. If this represents America or the world, we might have, it might be a fiery season. But also it is, if you want to look at it as close to Algol, the fixed star Algol. But really, I think, and, the most important thing is that it is going to be an eclipse that is 3 degrees of Taurus. So it's I should say it's opposite his sun. It's not on his sun, but it's for all intents and purposes, it hits his sun because of the opposite nature of it. And that means that the moon is 3 degrees of Taurus on that day. And then you get the Mars is going to be, there on his on that area of his sun in December, because Mars hits that eclipse degree. It's opposite the eclipse degree in December, and then in February, as Rahu hits that degree. So yeah, I think for Biden, November to February is a little worrying, whether it's Biden or it's the country. I don't know. I would have to kind of really look more at it, but I'm not talking doom and gloom, only because I don't like to do that. Even with Trump, I was worried about his health last September, but I mean, I didn't sort of go and really say, oh, he's going to die or anything like that. But it was the health of the country too. So I think there could be financial stuff going on in the world. Again, if you do Western astrology, or if you use Uranus, that Uranus-Saturn square is going to hit for a final time. And then you have the Neptune going direct again in November. So this is going to be an interesting eclipse for the world, for sure, and for his chart. So it's definitely affecting America. Again, it could affect him in different ways. I don't know. The sun in his chart is the ruler of his 10th, so it does have to do with something. Again, it's interesting because when that eclipse hit Trump's eclipse last year, Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away. So it doesn't have to be Biden himself, but it could be something in America that is important. It could be some change in the courts. It could be a change, of course, because, well, it's elections, but it's not really the election year that people are running, because that's next year, 2022. 2021 is not that kind of year. It could be anything in terms of his chart or the country.
If he did have Scorpio rising, which would be interesting for him in terms of talking about the Ketu transit in Scorpio, because Ketu is said to rule Scorpio according to many astrologers, and therefore it would then, I would say, behave differently for someone with Scorpio rising than it would for somebody with Libra rising, for example, right? So it's that maybe there are losses or something that he has to deal with in the country, or the country experiences losses. But let's face it, he himself personally came into power as soon as Ketu went into Scorpio. So there's that side of Ketu as well, the power side of it.
Right. And the other interesting thing, of course, is that the eclipse, this last eclipse, the one on May 26th, that was at 11 degrees of Scorpio. And if you do take his birth for 8:30 a.m., his ascendant is 10 Scorpio. So that eclipse would have also been, exactly on his ascendant. Descendant. I mean, of course, you can look at that and say, okay, this ascendant descendant has also to do with his partner, his wife. It can be a lot of different things. But this eclipse degree, yes, K2 is going to be like crossing over into that degree, and on his, ascendant, if it is 10 degrees, should be there, around September, mid-September. Too.
The thing is, no matter what way you look at that, though, I mean, surely K2's transit over his sun. I mean, the sun and K2, they just don't go hand in hand, right? There has to be some losses, even if you say it's just for the country.
Right. Yeah, for sure.
Right.
Yeah, but that's why I'm always with leaders. Obama had Mars Rahu in Leo in the 8th house. And when he got elected, he was in a Jupiter moon dasha. And so he went very quickly after the Jupiter moon into Jupiter Mars and Jupiter Rahu. And his Jupiter's in the 1st house. So people were really like, oh my God, he's going to get shot, he's going to die, because Mars and Rahu are 8th from Jupiter and 8th from his rising sign. He was in Jupiter Mars, Jupiter Rahu. None of that happened, of course. But, everything he wanted to do, of course, got opposition, which is what's happening with Biden too. He's, everybody is opposing him. I mean, not everybody in his party, the opposite party. So he is getting that, obstruction.
Right. I mean, He has to feel it some way. I mean, let's face it, if you were sitting with him and giving him a reading, if you were consulting with him, you'd be talking about these kinds of things in his personal life. So even if we don't see it on the screen, right, he's dealing with something, right?
Right. That's the point. It's always both, and with Trump, when that eclipse hit the moon, which is the Lord of the 12th and Lord sitting in the 4th, I said, that looks to me like he's going to be moving, So, that's what happened. It just didn't seem like a winning aspect,
And then when you tie that in with the country as well, like you do, it's like, it just makes so much sense now in hindsight. Of course, everything does, but 4th house being the lungs. And, he got COVID, and, him, being a representation of the country, how bad the US got it at that point after that, right? So it's like, it's both, right? He had it personally, but also the country had it in a really bad way.
The other thing that happened, I will say, that people also forget about, that I had been watching, was a month before the nodes changed signs and were on his nodes and on his, basic eclipse that he was born with. Brother passed away.
Right.
And his brother was, he was close to his brother. I mean, he had a good relationship with his brother, actually. His brother worked in the business with him. His brother was somebody, who didn't have the limelight as Trump did, but Trump always made sure he had a role in his business. So that was also a big personal loss. It didn't get like overplayed maybe throughout the world, but I was definitely watching it. So that's another thing with Biden is, remember, he has a family. He's got a bunch of brothers and sisters also, so, these are all things that can happen. Things can, it's a change, they're changes that take place,
Well, that's, I guess, Ronnie, that's a very nice way of saying, Taurus and Scorpio, that there are changes taking place, but let's face it, like, there are lots of people dying. There are bodies piled high in India right now that we are dealing with, or even if we're not personally, we know somebody who's got sick or dying, and if we don't, we see it on the screen. And basically, it's like this collective trauma, like I was saying, we're all dealing with at the moment, and that is obviously going to continue until K2 gets out of Scorpio. So that's how I want to leave this, I guess, podcast, with some sense of, okay, where is this going? Because everybody wants to see beyond the uncertainty and see something of some ending, or like you say, you do think that it's going to be like incrementally sort of stops and starts until next year. But then by April, they will have moved, right? They'll move out of Taurus and Scorpio.
Well, the eclipses do, and May 16th, one comes back.
More, right, one more back. That's again why you think it's a stop-start kind of thing.
Yeah.
Right.
But also I think because we're in such a fixed state right now with these, eclipses, everything is fixed.
Right.
And also other planets and stuff that are happening. I mean, we could talk for hours, and also the Jupiter cycle. I mean, I did think because when we had 2008, 2009, again, economic recovery goes along with this. We had fits and starts with that. And then 2010, we were kind of, wow. But even now the market is going crazy, not just the stock market, the real estate market.
Right.
But
then also that means that Jupiter is going to go back into Capricorn into its fall in the autumn. And therefore what you were talking about with these transits over the eclipse degrees, and as well as Jupiter, shows that there's going to be some economic challenges, further challenges.
And then we go back, and then it, I think, recovers, and I think we do well in 2000.
What was really interesting that I saw, and I don't know if you picked up on this, but basically Jupiter moves into Pisces the day before or after Ketu and the mean nodes Ketu and Rahu move out of Taurus and Scorpio.
That's interesting.
In the same 24-hour period in April next year, 2022. So that's at least something, and even if it is the stops and starts, and maybe we're like any virus, I guess, where even if you personally had a virus yourself, that it's kind of like the healing comes in like a healing crisis, right? And I think probably the world is going to have to experience that for another.
Well, it's also like anything, like even with addiction, you recover, then you have a relapse, then you can get better again. But there's always like the planets, of course, going direct and retrograde. They're leaving the sun, they're entering a new sign, but they're not quite in the next sign. They're going retrograde back into the previous sign, and then
do you find though that now you're getting to the point where we're over a year in, right? But it's still really, if you think about it in the terms of like historic events, it's still only been a year, let's face it. And you've looked at pandemics in the past, and they've been at least a couple of years, not more, right? Do you find that when you're speaking to clients now or anybody, and they're obviously going to ask you, okay, when's it going to end? And when is my life going to get back to normal, quote unquote, right? Do you find like you find yourself trying to sugarcoat something, or do you find like, are you skirting a fine line with that?
No, I find it's very interesting because some things you're just reading the way you would read them anyway. Because some people have lost their jobs and some people have done remarkably well in the pandemic. And some of them have bought houses and sold houses, and some people have created something new. You'd be surprised, because we live in a new world of remote everything. And of course, it depends on where you're living and who your clientele is. So it's kind of interesting. I mean, let's say my circle, like my friends and family, we've all done pretty well. Nobody's lost their job. Nobody got COVID. Well, my nephew had COVID in the very beginning. He's a doctor, and he's young, so he had it like for a week. His girlfriend had it for a week, but they didn't get it like badly. So it really, I think a lot of it depends on your circle, or where you're living. My nephew is a doctor, so he saw it. He saw the horrors of it, last year when it was just, the hospitals were just overflowing, so you talk to different people. I'm not a doctor, so I don't have that experience, I find that a lot of the stuff that I've been doing with readings, it's interesting that it's kind of stayed, you can still do the readings, and in a way it works, but I think that the couple things are different. So my example to clients is like, let's say you came to me, which you probably did maybe last January, February or something, and it was like, oh, wow, this is a great year to travel. You know what I mean? And then what happens is that, well, it didn't happen. Nobody could travel. So what did you do with all that energy? What did you do with that dasha, those transits? They're still activating that area of the chart, Right. So it has to do something, it has to come out in some other way.
This is also what I've seen myself with clients, is that actually it's those clients who are in dashas, who are in cycles of travel, of expansion, of growth, and they're locked down, that are finding it harder in a way, because they're like, they're not able to go anywhere and do anything with all of these things that they want to do, right? So where someone is kind of like on the same page and kind of in retreat mode, it's like, oh, this is great, I'm loving the downtime. I've seen that as well.
Right.
The thing is, I think that with nodes and the nature of them being eclipses and shadows and uncertain, and we can't see it, like a virus, we can't see it. It's that people just want answers, but you can't give it to them because it's just not knowable. And this is why people look for answers, even if it's not the right answer. Even if you take a grain of truth, and everything could be true on some level, but it's that, just give me an answer, I don't care whether it's true or not kind of thing almost.
Yeah, I think the other interesting thing, I just wanted to say one more event that just happened in the last week. again, like I said, with eclipses, things come to the surface. And it's of course interesting because, you know, Scorpio is has to do with the dead. They found those over 200 bodies of indigenous people in Kamloops, which was horrific, you know. And again, this is like during this eclipse, which is so typical, you know, of this kind of thing. I also think that, like I said, because the nodes are hitting eclipses the whole year, I mean, it's like these Taurus Scorpio eclipses, it's all like one event flowing into the next. You know, we've had, you know, in this country, Derek Chauvin was convicted of murdering George Floyd and all that. But what I'm saying is that a lot of the awful things that have happened, and of course, this is life in general. Maybe this is a good place to end. I mean, for every horrible thing that happens, you have to find some kind of healing from it. You have to find something positive from it. Otherwise, you might as well just close up your door and just, you know, not live your life. You know, so in the scheme of things, and in, you know, all the awful things that have happened in one's lifetime, you know, there has to be something positive that comes out of it, you know, or some change, you know, and I think that that's, I mean, you have to, otherwise, you know, I don't know what else to say. I mean, you have to, I mean, you don't have, I mean, there are people that have been really very affected by the lockdowns and pandemics, and, you know, anybody who has, you know, unfortunately self-destructive or suicidal tendencies, you know, that might have gotten even worse. But, you know, I think that if you can be an optimist, you know, that's the way to go. You know, in all these events, like one after another, you have to find, I think, that part of it, you know, that will really be good. And I think the other thing is that, like, also when you're dealing with Jupiter, you know, I mean, we've been talking so much about the heaviness of everything, but, you know, when you talk about Jupiter and you talk about the cycles of Jupiter, you know, especially when the nodes leave Taurus Scorpio, Jupiter goes into Aquarius. Well, it's going to go there fairly quickly. I mean, it'll be there, you know, in November. It'll go there till like next April, but then it's going to be in a nice aspect to where the nodes are going to be in March, are going to go into Aries, Libra. So, I mean, there are some things that you can sort of look at and, you know, kind of put into perspective. I mean, Jupiter was in Capricorn, the nodes were in Taurus, Scorpio, so it was still forming a trine, you know, so it's not all terrible that everything is locked up. You can always find these pockets of aspects that are illuminating, you know, the planets, as well as, you know, obstructing them, I think. You know?
Right. And I guess that's a good place to leave it. Like you say, it's like we have those pockets, and we also have the other side, like you said, the healing that is possible after all of this has been brought up. I think our listeners would really appreciate it. And
yeah, I appreciate it, because as you talk to me, then my wheels start spinning, and I'm like, oh, wow, I didn't look at it that way. And, you know, the interesting thing, of course, with, you know, the virus and the nodes, really, that's why I think the nodes and the virus and the eclipses really are so connected, because of that idea of shadowy things and, you know, not knowing what's happening. But,
right.
you know, I appreciate talking to you, because, like I said, it gets my wheels spinning, and I start thinking about things, you know?
Yeah, and this as well, and likewise, this is why I asked you on, because it gets me thinking as well more about these things. So tell me, where do people go and find more about you? And
yeah.
Are you doing anything new this year? Because I know it's all obviously lockdowns, but I think you are doing conferences and stuff.
You know, I mean, RonnieDreyer.com is my website, and there's information there, and you can sign up for my newsletter, which I send out once a month, twice a month, sometime these days, because of so many things happening. Can't write about everything at once. And that's where you find everything. I mean, it needs a very good workout. I mean, that website needs complete renovation, but, you know, everything is slow. Yeah, and then I'm, you know, I mean, I talk, I give classes, you know, I have an ongoing group, and I must say, because of the pandemic, my class was really successful this year, because people were home. They were, you know, busy. They wanted information, you know, and they weren't going out. So that went really well. And I've got a lot of books in the, you know, I'm working on a couple different things. I'm also working with a group trying to do some translating from the Sanskrit text that is not done in English called Vridaya Vinajadika, and I'm hoping to make more, headway with that. It's nice. I'm working with Sanskrit scholars, and I am not a Sanskrit scholar, so for me, it's like been really great working.
You have studied Sanskrit.
Well, I have an MA, which is not a PhD, and yeah, my Sanskrit is okay, but it's, I have to keep working at it. But, I think some of the people I'm working with, they need me more for the actual astrological knowledge, because a lot of these people are not practitioners. They're taking texts and they're translating. So I can look at them and say, hey, wait a minute, you're translating something literal, but it really means this, because that's how it's applied.
Right.
Yeah, so I think that's kind of how it goes. And yeah, I mean, I'm always talking, people are always inviting me to conferences. And so it'll be on my website, the more of them that I participate in. I think a lot of people are getting a little bit Zoom fatigue. I'm getting Zoom fatigue myself.
Yeah. No, I know, I hear you. Well, not me, because I'm an introvert.
Yeah, you're an introvert. I'm an extrovert.
You're an extrovert. Okay. For me, it's great because I get to see and talk to people, but I'm at home. Perfect. Right. Best of both worlds. Because I actually am quite social for an introvert. So this actually is it's quite a good way for me to connect with people. But then I just need to turn off the computer and then I'm at home. So it's great.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's been great talking to you, Ronnie, again.
You too, Gary.
So thank you for listening to the podcast. Remember, you can get more information on Ronnie at ronniedreyer.com. That's RONNIEDREYER, ronniedreyer.com. My own website here is timelineastrology.com. And you can also sign up as a patron on the Timeline Astrology website. You can also go to patreon.com/Timeline Astrology. I write daily in-depth reports for patrons, as well as monthly forecasts and video horoscopes. So check it out. That's timelineastrology.com. Once again, thank you for listening to the podcast, and until next time.